How's it going, folks? Can you hear me? Just let me know in the chat when you all can hear me. The volume should be pretty good at this point. Alright, so let's get started. It's a pretty low turnout, sadly, only about 5 of you, so hopefully there's going to be a whole lot more people watching this after the fact. Otherwise, well, if more people get the extra credit than 5 of you, then I'm going to be suspicious, and we'll go from there. But anyway, let's just get rolling so we can do this quickly and hopefully efficiently tonight. So let me get this going. So the test tomorrow, as it says on the screen right now, we have 45 questions. It's going to be. It ended up being a little longer than we thought, just because it is a decent amount of material. It's going to be all multiple choice, and since it is going to be fairly long, it is going to be completely retakeable, and corrections and all that stuff, just like the past couple ones have been. So just so you know that, so you're not getting there tomorrow and anticipating anything that it's not going to be. All right, so let's kind of jump in. And let's get rolling. So let's kind of go in the way we were talking, right? So this is going to be on the different independence movements as well as the contemporary world, right? So let's start with India, okay? So this might be slightly different than what you guys saw, but it's more or less going to be the same information, right? So India is what we're talking about first, right? So we know when World War II ended, independence movements are going to begin kind of around the former European colonies, right? Because when it comes down to it, you're going to have the issue with the UN. The UN Charter guaranteeing colonial populations the right to this idea of self-determination. And self-determination is this idea that they can choose the type of government that they're going to be, they want themselves, right? To self-determine the government that they're going to be ruled by. Right, that's what the charter says. European powers had put a whole lot of resources and men and things into World War II, and ultimately they were weaker than where they were prior to World War II, following World War II. So this is going to be kind of a perfect time for some of these colonies to break off and find that independence, right? And you had situations where European powers were unwilling to hold on to colonies around the world, but in some cases they were then also unable to, right? Because of the reasons that we just said, effectively people are going to be able to break away, right? So scrolling down. And you're going to begin to get these waves of nationalistic sentiment, right? These areas where they were colonial possessions, they're no longer going to wish to be controlled by this third party, this outside force, and they're going to want that self-determination, and they're going to want their own culture and their own independence and all of that stuff to not be subdued by these colonial powers anymore, right? So they're going to begin to seek out that independence from these European powers. And this is going to be a theme that we're going to be talking about throughout this a bit, right? And sometimes this is going to be bloody, sometimes it's going to be peaceful, right? And it's going to lean more toward the bloody side, sadly, than peaceful often, right? So independence in India, right? For starters, we know that India was dominated by the English. They'd been dominated by the English for a number, of centuries at this point. They'd been economically influenced by England as early as the 1700s, and it's not going to be until maybe the middle of the 1800s and late 1800s where you're going to have the absolute full colonial rule that we are familiar with, and India is going to become one of the known as the crown jewel of England because of the wealth that it's able to generate out of the region to bring back to England, right, in this colonial relationship that we've learned about and talked about all throughout the year, right? You're also going to get this improvement of India's infrastructure by England to improve the amount of resources that they can take out, right? Roads and railways and things like that, right? So that's kind of the snapshot, if you will, of India, following around World War II. So when we get into World War II, now England is going to utilize their colonies for forces for World War II, and they're going to do this often without really consulting the colonial nations that they controlled, right? Because, well, if they have complete control, then that's what they're going to do, right? So this is kind of a slap in the face to India a little bit, but the British don't particularly care. And what's going to happen is you're going to have this nationalistic group, including Gandhi, right, launch this campaign against the British, right? And this is great in theory, but part of the problem is that India isn't necessarily completely united themselves, right? So you have about 350 million Hindus, and you also have 100 million Muslims around 1940, right? And if Britain is going to kind of give up power, then the question becomes, who does it get handed off to? And obviously the one group's going to want it to be given to them, and the other group is going to be wanted giving it to them, right? So you're going to have now this kind of clashes between them as well. England ultimately is going to attempt to limit the economic and political rights of Indians, right? Many Indians the Indian people are going to actually receive an English education. They're going to learn of English nationalism and democracy from this kind of teachings, and ultimately you're going to have the creation of two different kind of leagues, right? The one is the Indian National Congress, which is going to be more or less created by the Hindus, wanting Hindu control of India, and then you're going to have the Muslim League, created by the Islamic groups in India, right? And you still have this kind of conflict and strife in India a bit today between the two different groups. So you're going to get clashes between all of these different powers, right? Attempting to kind of take control. You're going to attempt to get, sorry, I'm trying to read the chat as well. So you're going to have both these groups trying to gain control. You're trying to have the British not lose control. And what the British attempt to try to do is to kind of create two different groups, right? Two different areas of this region. One area of the region is going to be decidedly Muslim, right? They're going to allow the Muslims to live there. This area is going to become known as Pakistan, and then millions of these people are going to kind of have to decide which nation they're going to want to live in. So in 1947, 10 million people were moving all around India to these new regions, right? So enter Mahatma Gandhi, whatever you want to call him is fine. He is an English-educated man. He's going to ultimately work for the British in South Africa, and effectively they are going to bring this idea of a free India to the common people, right? And once these ideas kind of get out there, they kind of start to catch like wildfire, right? And Gandhi is going to largely be known for the whole idea of civil disobedience and passive resistance through nonviolence, right? And he's going to urge the Indians to boycott the British goods that are being sold there. And as this is going on, the British are meeting the civil disobedience and this passive resistance and nonviolence with violence, right? Arresting them and sometimes attacking and even outright killing protesters. Ruben, to answer your question about what did the British gain from holding territory there, there's all sorts of different things, right? All the different resources you can get out of India. You had, you had spices, you had lumber, you had textiles, you had lots of different things coming out of India that they were extracting that were valuable, right? You have jewels, you have all sorts of things. So, anyway, Indian independence, right? In 1947, British Indian Empire was broken into several different countries. You're going to have India, which is largely a Hindu country, and then you're going to get West Pakistan, which is going to be Islamic country, which is going to become just Pakistan in 1971, with East Pakistan as well. And East Pakistan is going to become Bangladesh, right? So you've kind of got this region of Pakistan that's going to kind of broken up itself as well. And Gandhi himself is going to actually be assassinated by Hindu extremists in 1948. So continuing to the line, right? This is what the partition of India is going to actually look like, right? So Pakistan in the west, Bangladesh in the east, with India kind of in the middle in 1971. So now Indian democracy, right? This Republic of India, it is the world's largest democratic nation, right? There are so many people in India today. We're talking 1.1 to 1.3 billion people, and ultimately it's a federal system that gives many powers to the different states, right? And you're going to have, I did actually, Ruben, to answer your question though. But anyway, so you have this 1950 Constitution that's going to kind of try to actually push against caste discrimination that we've seen in India as well, and all of these different things are going to be kind of, again, pushing this democratic ideals in India that they've gotten from elsewhere in the world. I'm going to butcher the name here, sadly. So anyway, your first Prime Minister of India is this person named Jawaharlal Nehru, which is the first Prime Minister. They're a close associate of Gandhi. They support Western-style industrialization, right? And they're going to be taking control of the industrial processes, right? They're trying to allow the same kind of capitalistic mindset, I suppose, in the West there to foster this growth. That's going to be kind of a big push in the right direction for India here. Next, you're going to get Indira Gandhi, right, which is someone we've kind of looked a lot more in class, where you have another India Prime Minister there. She's going to really push a developed nuclear program, right, and a closer relationship with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And this is going to become kind of problematic, actually, for the West in some capacity, this close relationship with the Soviet Union. Okay, so that's really a quick summary of our Indian independence here, so let's kind of keep moving along so we can kind of do this as efficiently as possible. So the same kind of deal, right? After World War II, you're going to have the independence pushes in Africa, right? For the same reasons. You have African pride in culture and heritage, resentment toward the imperial rule and economic exploitation of the colonial powers, the whole idea of self-determination by the UN Charter, right? All of the same things and themes are going to be applying here for them, right? So the European powers, however, are not going to be as happy about giving up these colonies in Africa in some capacity as they were in Asia, right? So you're going to have Great Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, and all these places are going to have lost colonies around the world in some capacity, and you're going to now have this concentration in Africa, right, of these countries and these groups and these regions trying to get their independence from their European colonial masters, I suppose. So some are peaceful, some are not. Some big examples of peaceful transitions is kind of in Western Africa, where they're going to be kind of gaining some independence from France, but there's also areas in Northern Africa where they're not going to have this peaceful transition, right? So you have Western Africa here, and these areas in green are going to be kind of getting their independence here eventually, and this is kind of what considered French West Africa in 1947, okay? So other Western African countries, right, you're going to start to get Northwestern here with Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, right? All of these kind of having been heavily influenced by France in particular here across the Mediterranean. So Algeria, as I was just pointing out, is kind of the closest to France, is going to be now where one of these violent wars takes place. Right, so you have this independence being won through a violent war, where you're going to have about a million French colonists that had lived in Algeria. Meanwhile, you're going to have about 9 million Arabs as well. So when World War II ends, these French colonists are going to kind of refuse to share the power with the Algerians in the way the UN Charter and such was looking to allow to make happen in the self-determination. And both sides are going to kind of commit troops to this, right? But the French had been weakened pretty substantially following World War II, and fighting people in their own, in their own region, in their own homes, is tough, right? So the Algerians effectively were able to push off the French and win this kind of battle for independence for themselves, right? So that's where Algeria is on a map, so hopefully you are familiar with that. Next we have Kenya, right? We also talked about Kenya, where they are also going to kind of win their independence through fighting, right? Through this violent war against the English, in particular, under the leadership of a man named Jomo Kenyatta. And just as a quick summary of what's going on, right? The British colonists, when they came in, had taken a lot of the best land. So when the people under Kenyatta, the Mau Mau, this secret society, they're going to kind of fight this guerrilla-style war against the farmers, trying to push them out, and effectively are going to be successful, right? Kenya's a long way from England, and if there's hostile groups there, it's pretty hard for them to kind of maintain, right? So Kenya is down here on underneath the Horn, kind of underneath Somalia and Ethiopia. So hopefully you're familiar with that. Next, we had South Africa, right? We watched the bio on Nelson Mandela, but also the discussions about apartheid and things, right? And the South Africans had kind of been independent from Britain as early as 1934, so prior to World War II, but the South African government had instituted this policy known as apartheid, right, which is this racial segregation and separation that we talked about, right, where they actually ban social contact between the races. Blacks are forbidden to live in white areas, except in some cases when they're servants. You're going to have the black population is actually 75% of the people in South Africa. However, the white population in South Africa is going to force them to live within a 13% area of the land, right? In these areas that are, it's segregation at its peak here. And it's not going to be for a almost 60-something years, really, where you're going to kind of get this push and this apartheid, 50-something years anyway, till 1994, when you're going to kind of start to get this push for a multiracial government in South Africa. And this push is going to become largely from Nelson Mandela, among other people fighting for this as well. Nelson Mandela will become the first black president of the Republic of South Africa, and kind of get past and end this whole idea, this whole thing of apartheid, right? All right, so let's jump into the Middle East as well, right? So that's kind of it for Africa, in a quick summary anyway. So the Ottoman Empire had been a thing, right? And they had dominated the Middle East since the 1400s, right? All the way up through World War I, right? And for years, these different Islamic groups in the area, they struggled for independence from the Ottomans, but often these struggles were not necessarily successful. The Ottomans had been successful in keeping them down here, right? So I'm going to take this moment, and the extra credit tomorrow is and I guess the next day after that is going to be just simply, where is the regional track and field meet going to be occurring? And if you can answer just Robinson, then I suppose you're going to get a point. All right, so moving on. So World War I, the Ottomans, they're going to side with the Germans and the Central Powers, and effectively when the Central Powers and the Germans lose the war, the Ottoman Empire is going to kind of be abolished and cease to exist in the same capacity, right? So the League of Nations establishes what's known as the mandate system to kind of administer the areas that had existed under Ottoman Empire rule in the Middle East, right? So you're going to get two kind of main European powers benefiting from the mandate system, right? Largely the French and the British, right? So you're going to have the French mandates, which are going to kind of take control of Syria and Lebanon, and the British mandates are going to really be taking charge of kind of Jordan area, Transjordan at the time, and Palestine, which is going to become part of what becomes Israel later on. Okay, so the mandate system right here, right? So you're going to have Jewish Palestine here in the west and Transjordan here in the east. This is going to be a largely British occupied and British controlled area, right? And if you look above, Iraq is also a British mandate. Syria is going to be French, and Lebanon up here is going to be French. Do I have another map? Nope, just that one. Okay, so this is kind of the area of the world that we're talking about as far as the mandates after World War I, right? And this creates problems, right? Because effectively, you're going to have Christian Western countries controlling non-Christian and Islamic peoples and non-Western peoples, right? It's going to set up this whole Jewish people versus Arab people conflict in Palestine as well, and things kind of get ugly in the Middle East for a bit, right? But ultimately, you're going to get World War II, right? And World War II is going to kind of obviously take precedence around the world here a bit, with some fighting going on, you know, in these areas in Northern Africa, but also in these areas, especially over oil. But eventually the mandate system is going to be kind of phased out after World War II, right? And the United Nations is going to kind of end this whole idea of the main mandate system, and it's going to begin to draw more of these lines, and new states going to be created in the Middle East following World War II. Okay, so these new states that come out after World War II, right? You're going to get Syria, and again, was part of the mandate system. You're going to get Lebanon, which was also French mandate, right? Which you have this Mediterranean architecture in some of these areas, right? Jordan and Israel as well, right? Are new states that come out after World War II, right? So following World War II, many Jewish people left Europe, right, for Palestine, which was this Jewish homeland. And when Israel is officially recognized by the Western powers, it's going to be carved out of this former area of Palestine, right? And Palestine is not going to be recognized as a country, but it's still going to be there's going to be Arab people and Islamic people in this area as well, right? Because as far as the religions go, they're both very important. This area is very important to both of these three major religions, right? All the Abrahamic religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, right? This area is extremely important for those religions, right? So this is how Israel is eventually carved out, right? You're going to have this kind of around the West Bank here, and such, right? So mostly Jewish areas here. You're going to have international areas kind of in the middle here. It's kind of carved out of what was Palestine, right, in 1947. And this just kind of leaves potential for issues, right? So is attempts to creation of a state of Palestine, right? You're going to get these territorial issues. What's the question in the status of the city of Jerusalem? Water rights in the Mediterranean. You're going to have Palestinian refugees and all sorts of things. There's some pretty serious problems in this area of the world still today. And you're going to have some major wars that are fought between Israel and some of the Middle East, right? In particular, Egypt and some of these Palestinian groups. So these are issues that for sure are going on in the world at the time, right? So this is Palestine following the UN partition, but then eventually you're going to kind of get this more of a breakdown just a year or two later after the Palestine and Israel war here. So you can get the West Bank, which is under Jordanian control. You can have some Egyptian control down here at the Gaza Strip, and ultimately, Israel is going to win this war and effectively take control of the area, from the Palestinians, which are not going to be happy about this new relationship, right, and losing control of the territory. So some important leaders of Israel at the time, you have Golda Meir, who is the prime minister of Israel, and after these initial setbacks, Israel is going to win victory in what's called the Yom Kippur War, where they're going to kind of seek support of the United States and continue to kind of solidify Israel as an entity, right, after World War II. You also have Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was president of Egypt, and they're going to kind of have their own entity as well following the probably not Sydney. So they're gonna in Egypt. They're gonna nationalize the Suez Canal. They're gonna take that control of that for Egypt, which is kind of a pretty big deal because of the power that affords them and the control over that really highly important geographic point. They're gonna establish a bit of a relationship with the Soviet Union, kind of much against what the Western hope, and also they're gonna build what's called the Aswan High Dam. So that's kind of, again, quick in a nutshell for the Middle East. So if you're doing, if you're familiar with this stuff going into tomorrow, you should do fairly okay, I would say. So let's kind of get into our last topic here. We're going to run through the last set of notes. I just got to get them up on the screen. Sorry, give me one more second. Apparently I lost that link. I must have closed the window. Alright, last kind of hurrah here, I suppose. Okay, so I'm going to make this a little larger for you guys. That's hopefully good on your screen, right? So, anyway, contemporary world stuff, right? Now that we've kind of gone through the independence movements and the pushes away from colonialism and following World War II, let's talk about kind of some of this the contemporary stuff that's going on. And then we talked about this in class. Ms. Kipperman went over this stuff in a good amount of detail. So let's get going, right? So, what regions of the world have countries that are considered developed, right? And what does that mean and such, right? So, developed countries, we can probably say things like North America, Europe, Australia, Japan, South Korea, parts of Asia, for sure you can consider developed, right? And what this means is a high standard of living, a higher quality of life, right? And how is that determined typically? It's kind of usually GDP per capita, right? So what this means is kind of the amount of economic activity that the country is generating per person, right? The types of jobs, right? Often non-agricultural jobs, better access to consumer goods, right? Things like that. Social things, high literacy rates, good access to healthcare, right? Equality and women's rights and things like that, right? Low infant mortality rates, low birth rates, low death rates, high life expectancies, low population growth. These are all kind of signs of what it means to be a developed country in this world, right? So now let's go to the opposite, right? What does it mean to be developing, right? So as far as developing goes, we can say parts of the Middle East, right? Parts of Africa, right? Central Africa in particular, Southeast Asia areas, right? Parts of, yeah. So anyway, right? So typically, these developing countries have a low standard of living, right? Lower qualities of life, at least in comparison, right? So what that means is low GDPs often, right? The types of jobs are kind of more agriculturally based. A lot of times, sometimes it's even subsistence agriculture, right? Little access to kind of some of the consumer goods that we are familiar with, right? So social, right? These people have opposite, right? Lower literacy rates, little to no access to healthcare, probably less access to internet and things like that today, right? Low equality for women, which often leads to high infant mortality rates and high birth rates and high death rates, low life expectancies, right? High population growth. All of these things can be seen in what you consider a developing nation, right? So what are some other things going on, right? Environmental challenges, right? We have pollution, right, becoming a big thing. We have the issues with plastics in the oceans and CO2 emissions and things like that, right? We have deforestation and loss of habitats, right? Rainforests in Southeast Asia. You have rainforests in South America and Central America, and deforestation and elsewhere around the world, right? Climate change, rapid population growth around the world, and just in general human population. We're over 7 billion, rapidly approaching 8 billion. So that's a lot of people, right? Non-renewable energy, right? Economic development overall. You know, some countries are rich and some countries aren't, and ultimately that gap is definitely some things that are going on today, right? Medical issues. We have things like genetic engineering and cloning, the whole idea of right to die and abortion, right? And all of these things are some of these things are even heavily in the news today. So social challenges countries face, right? You have poverty and poor health, illiteracy, famine, migration. Immigration is pretty big, right? And we have some pretty large crises, right? Human crises going on around the world, and people trying to leave them and migrating away from them today, right? So this leads to issues with guest workers, right? People trying to find work and trying to be able to make a living for themselves and make a living for their families, right? So people often try to get permission to temporarily work in either Europe or in the United States, temporary visas and things like that as a guest and guest worker. That, you know, this is a fairly large thing. You have guest workers in Middle Eastern countries, places like Dubai and Qatar and UAE and things like that, right? So building some of these skyscrapers and things that we know that are going on over there. So free market, right? What is it? What are the advantages of free market over government-controlled market? And can you think of any countries that have recently gone through a change to a free market and improved their economy, right? So free market is just a system where prices and goods are determined by the open market or the consumer. You have a rising standard of living, right? Expanding middle class, more political freedoms often, right? Places like Taiwan and South Korea are instances of these where, you know, overall, probably within the last 50 years or so, you're going to kind of get these transitions to free markets away from less than free, right? So you have regional integration, right? Some examples of trade agreements, you have things like NAFTA, you have the World Trade Organization, the UN, right? IMF, you know, things like these neighboring countries are kind of beginning to depend on each other for mutual benefit, right? Allowing freedom of goods and services to flow between the countries, right? Without placing these huge tariffs on each other, right? This is actually in the news too right now. You have this big kind of trade conflict, if you will, between America and China, going in kind of this tariff war between each other right now. So we'll see how that kind of works out. So why is it important to have clearly defined borders between countries, and do you think they're necessary, right? So this was a bit of an opinion, right? But clearly defined borders often allow, if you don't have a clearly defined border and a clearly defended border, if you need, you know, in certain situations, well, it's tricky, right? Because then you can't necessarily know who's coming into your country, and issues with things like terrorism and things like that, obviously that gets a little bit tricky, right? So, anyway, some 5 examples of multinational corporations, right? You have things like Apple, Microsoft, McDonald's, Starbucks, Burger King, there's tons of them, right? Other countries, multinational, right? You have Samsung, IKEA, Nokia, Toyota, Huawei, Yamaha, right? Lots of different multinational countries. Sorry. Hi, Ahmed. How are you doing? But anyway, so you have this defining the word of terrorism, right? So the definition of terrorism specifically is the use of violence and intimidation for political reasons, right? And political gain. So some of these examples, right? We've got 9/11, the Munich Olympics, the Boston Marathon, right? All of these people had more or less political ambitions with what they were doing, right? And some of these lead to car bombs and hijackings and suicide bombs, right? Opening fire, right? All these different acts of terrorism, you know, that are going on, right? So how do governments often respond to terrorism, right? Well, we've had an increased surveillance state, right? We've had decreases in our rights to privacy and things like that, whether you agree with that or not, and increased security at airports, right? Meaning ID badges, privacy rights, all of these things are, you know, front and center into the debates today, right? And then ultimately, what other parts of the world are known for ethnic and religious conflicts, right? You've got the Middle East, obviously. You have Northern Ireland, the Catholics versus the Protestants. You have Christians versus Islam, you know, Muslims in the Balkans. You have the Horn of Africa. Somalia is essentially a failed state, where there's been a lot of issues with warlords and things like that. Black Hawk Down in the 1900s, early 1990s anyway, if you're familiar with that story. You have Southeast Asia, and you have genocidal things going on in Cambodia, right? So there are some major ethnic and religious, you know, conflicts around the world. You have issues going on in with Saudi Arabia and Yemen right now, right, and arguably genocidal actions there occurring as well. So there's obviously some major areas in the world that are, you know, still experiencing ethnic and religious conflicts today. Okay, so at this point, that's kind of a quick run through. I don't really have anything more to talk about. I realize I kind of went through it fairly quickly. So if you have any questions, I'll give you about 30 seconds to a minute now to answer them, or to ask them. And if there's no questions, then I'm going to sign off for the night and leave you guys to your studying. Alright, guys, I am signing off, it seems, since no one's really going to have any questions. So, see you guys later. Good luck.